President Trump consistently for many, many years has admired Vladimir Putin. He is calling Zelenskyy a dictator and never criticizing Putin.
Do we already have these grounds to claim that negotiations have actually begun on Ukraine without Ukraine?
The negotiations should have started with the Ukrainian side, not the Russian side.
This meeting in Saudi Arabia.
You never give concessions at the beginning of negotiations. I think it will not lead to a good deal for my country and American national interests.
Ambassador McFaul, thank you very much for your time and welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
I will start probably with the most obvious question. Do you understand what Trump's strategy is regarding Ukraine, Russia, and Russian-Ukrainian war?
No, I do not. I do not understand it. I have my guesses, which is I think President Trump, first and foremost, wants to have a peace deal that he can say that he proposed. And I don't think he's worried about whether it's successful or not. I think what he wants most of all is to say, I proposed an end to the war. And if the war ends, he'll be happy. But if it doesn't end, he'll say, well, I've made a proposal and that the Ukrainians didn't accept it or that the Russians didn't accept it. It's not my fault.
Do you already see the, let me say so, the outlines of this peace deal? I mean, what we've heard the day before, after the negotiations in Saudi Arabia, at the press conference of US President Trump's, it was mainly about some kind of Ukraine's concessions. At least it seemed like this. Do you think that these outlines of this potential peace deal is something wider than what we've heard on Tuesday?
Well, so far, all I've heard, both on the record and in informal conversations, are the concessions that Ukraine needs to make. Ukraine needs to give Russia territory. Ukraine cannot be a member of NATO. American soldiers will not be in Ukraine as part of a peacekeeping force. Ukraine needs to give the United States 50% of the profits of minerals that will be produced. Ukraine needs to have presidential elections before the negotiations start. All of these things are concessions to Putin. And I've negotiated with the Russians. I've negotiated with Putin. You never give concessions at the beginning of negotiations. You give concessions during the process of negotiations. And what has been missing from the Trump strategy is any sign that they are trying to achieve concessions from Vladimir Putin. I hope they change their tactics. I hope they learn. They're a brand new team. They've only been at this for a few weeks. But this will not lead to a lasting peace settlement. If you just give Putin everything he wants, he's just going to ask for more.
What we saw recently was probably the first contacts between the US and Russian administrations. Why are they so alarming to you? I mean, maybe these are only, like some kind of preliminary contacts. Why you are so worried with what you heard?
Well, I appreciate the fact that President Trump is trying to mediate an end to the barbaric invasion of your country. I think it has to be part of that is to have direct contacts with the Russian government. So I'm not critical of the actual meeting itself. What I worry about is we are not used to this. We have a team. Our team has been on the job for a few weeks. Sergei Lavrov has been doing this for 21 years. I negotiated with Lavrov and Ushakov. And what I see is a very classic Russian negotiating tactic, which is to give nothing, to demand everything, and to wait for the other side, in the interests of getting a deal, to start negotiating between themselves. And that's exactly what I see happening now. And I think it will not lead to a good deal for my country and American national interests. And I don't think it'll lead to a good deal for your country. So I think they need to recalibrate. I think they need to figure out what they're trying to achieve. And then the second thing they need to figure out is what will produce an enduring peace. a lasting peace, not just one that'll last for a few months or for a few years, and then allow Putin to invade and attack your country again.
I want to make this remark for our audience that we are recording this interview the day after the negotiations in the Saudi Arabia took place, the day after we heard from US President Trump's what we've heard on his vision regarding Russia, Ukraine and Russian-Ukrainian war. Do we already have these grounds to claim that negotiations have actually begun on Ukraine without Ukraine?
Yes and no. So most certainly, Secretary Rubio and Foreign Minister Lavrov were talking about Ukraine in the contours of a peaceful settlement. And at the table were Saudi officials and no Ukrainian officials. Think about how strange that is. You saw representatives from the government of Saudi Arabia sitting at that table. There were no representatives from the government of Ukraine and no representatives from the European Union or the NATO alliance. I think that is a big mistake. Second, if you're going to have shuttle diplomacy between Moscow and Kiev, and sometimes that's worked in the past, think of Henry Kissinger in the Middle East, the negotiations should have started with the Ukrainian side, not the Russian side, so that our positions were coordinated ahead of time. So in my opinion, this was the exact opposite of that. But I want to make a bigger point. The Russians were very clear in their comments about Saudi Arabia. Mr. Ushakov in particular, who is a close presidential advisor to Putin. He's been there for many, many years. I used to deal with him personally when I was the ambassador to Moscow. He made very clear that they were in Saudi Arabia, not necessarily to negotiate an end to the war. They were in Saudi Arabia to restart and rehabilitate U.S.-Russian relations. And if you look at the readout and you look at what President Putin said today, that was their chief objective. Not just talking about Ukraine, but the Middle East and energy agreements and all sorts of other things. So from their perspective, they've already achieved their primary objective from Saudi Arabia, which is the beginning of contact between the United States and Russia.
It really seems like the US delegation really wanted some kind of a reset between the United States and Russia. And you are often being called as one of the architects of the famous US-Russian reset back in 2009. So what is wrong with the reset? With this aspiration that the current US administration probably want to achieve?
When I was working at the White House, and this word reset was used to describe what we were doing with the Russians, our objectives were very clear. We wanted, for instance, the Russians to negotiate a New START treaty with us. We wanted the Russians to open the northern corridor into Afghanistan so we could supply our soldiers through Russia and not just Pakistan. We wanted the Russians to join with us in sanctioning Iran so we could pressure Iran to do an Iran nuclear deal. And all that historians judge whether those were good deals or not, but we were negotiating with the Russians for very concrete outcomes that we thought advanced American national security interests. It was not a meeting to hold hands and sing Kumbaya and to say we're now friends with the Russians. That was never my motivation ever. And what I'm worried about is that we are making the meeting the goal and not the means to ends that advance America's national interests. We are making good relations the goal. That should never be the goal in diplomacy, even with our friends and partners. Good relations, happy talk should never be the goal of diplomacy. It should be concrete things that advance your country's interests. And so far, I have not heard one thing that have come out of these talks in Saudi Arabia that advance America's national interests. And most certainly, I haven't heard anything that is good for Ukrainian national interests.
If we get back to the statements made by US President Trump after the negotiations in Saudi Arabia, in particularly, he said that it is very important for Ukraine to hold elections. Right before our interview, President Trump called President Zelensky a dictator without elections. How do you see this viewpoint of US President Trump on this issue of elections? Why he has so many questions to Zelensky and don't have many questions to Putin, who has been in power for such a long time already?
Well, first, as an American speaking on Ukrainian television, I want to apologize for President Trump's remarks. As an American, I am embarrassed that he is saying such things which we know not to be true. When he said that President Zelensky has a 4% approval rating, that is just not true. And it's very easy to search multiple polls to show that it's not true. Second, I find it appalling that he is calling Zelensky a dictator when he is negotiating with Putin and never criticizing Putin. Putin has been a dictator in power for a quarter of a century, for 25 years, without any free and fair elections in that country. And when President Trump sent his vice president to the Munich Security Conference, where I was just a few days ago, and had him chastise the Europeans for their bad practices of democracy, and not say a word about Russia or Belarus for that matter, that was also deeply embarrassing to me. By the way, in the room at the Munich Security Conference was Yulia Navalnaya. Her husband was killed by Vladimir Putin for trying to participate in free and fair elections. You know who else was in the room? Zhana Nemtsova. Her father was killed by Putin for being an opposition figure. And so I just am embarrassed that he has this view. What I think is happening is Mr. Trump, President Trump, is getting his information from Russian propagandists. He's in an information ecosystem that reflects Putin's view. And I just wish he would spend more time talking to Ukrainians, listening to Ukrainian points of view. I wish you would have met with the soldiers that I met with from your country in Munich, who would have explained to him what the tragedies of this war. But unfortunately, he's getting just one set of news. And I hope that when his national security team now gets in place, I hope when the director of the CIA briefs him the next time, that he will disabuse President Trump of this bad information, because it's dangerous in two respects. One, it just means that Trump doesn't understand the situation. But two, it undermines his negotiating team when dealing with the Russians. It weakens their position because Putin, when he hears that, thinks, well, I can keep asking for more because my position is stronger.
Is there any ways how Ukraine or Ukraine's President Zelensky may influence this current situation?
Well, I can't imagine how frustrating it must be for President Zelensky and his team, but they have just one choice. They have a choice to try to talk to President Trump. I hope President Zelensky is asking for a phone call right now so that he can talk directly to President Trump to try to educate him about his interests. I hope the rest of the Ukrainian government is reaching out to other parts of the Trump administration. From what I understand, they had a productive meeting between President Zelensky and Vice President Vance in Munich. They need to be asking for such meetings as often as possible. And then second, they need to be helping educate the rest of America, Republican senators, so that President Trump begins to understand through social media, through our media more broadly, that he's making mistakes.
If we speak about this issue with elections and all the statements that US President Trump made, in your opinion, should the Ukrainian leadership, let me say so, succumb to the pressure of the American side in this question?
That's a question for President Zelensky and his team and the Ukrainian people, not for an American. I think it would be impossible, of course, to have a presidential election while the war is still going on. So most certainly there would have to be a ceasefire. But ultimately, that I think is a question for President Zelensky, not for me.
Earlier this month, the U.S. Treasury Secretary presented to Zelensky the proposal on Ukraine's rare earth minerals. And if we believe the reports in the media, the U.S. administration demanded immediate approval of this agreement, but Ukrainian side didn't agree to that. Could this be a reason of what we see and hear now from the U.S. administration?
Yes, I think that's a good observation. I think perhaps President Trump is disappointed that the Ukrainian government, President Zelensky, did not sign that agreement. And so that's why he may be attacking him publicly the way he is doing it. I personally think this is a really bad tactic on behalf of my government. I don't want to go back to an era of imperialism and colonialism. And I say that not just about this agreement, but about some of the statements about Greenland, the Panama Canal, making Canada the 51st state. I want to be clear. I'm against these things because I don't think they're in American national interests. I think we are weaker when we alienate our partners and friends. We are weaker when we capitulate to dictators like Vladimir Putin. And then in the long run, I think that makes America weaker and is not good for our prosperity and our security. So I hope that there can be some accommodation, some kind of agreement, mediated agreement on that document, because it most certainly looks like it is very important to President Trump.
Do you think that the US President Trump even consider Vladimir Putin to be a dictator?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to it, but I don't think he's troubled by dictators. I am. I believe in democracy and I'm against dictatorship. I have been for my entire life. I've fought against dictators and supported Democrats to the best of my abilities for decades. But when I listen to President Trump, I don't think he thinks in those terms. I think he thinks in terms of strong leaders and weak leaders, and he thinks Putin's a strong leader, and he thinks of himself as being a strong leader, and therefore the things that trouble me about Vladimir Putin, I don't think troubles the American president.
As you mentioned, we now observe that the United States are trying to restore their relations with Russia, but without any clear aims. So why are the United States doing this? In your opinion, why is it so important for President Trump's team?
Well, President Trump consistently for many, many years has admired Vladimir Putin. It's a mystery to me why. But he's very consistent on that. He's changed his views on many other foreign policies. He's never changed his views about Vladimir Putin. So I think at the essence, he just wants to restore that bilateral relationship because he admires Vladimir Putin. Second, I don't know for sure, but I have a suspicion that Putin and his government are informally offering economic deals to the United States as a way to induce President Trump to help the Russian side when it comes to the war in Ukraine. And in particular, I think Putin wants sanctions to be lifted. I was very struck that in the delegation in Saudi Arabia was Mr. Dmitriev. He is not a Russian government official. He runs their investment fund. He does deals. And the fact that he was in Saudi Arabia suggests to me that this is going to be some future negotiation about economic deals. And we know that Trump likes big economic deals. That appeals to him. And I think the Russians are very deliberately offering or suggesting that this might be part of a future bilateral relationship with the United States.
I have just a couple of questions for you as a co-chairman of the International Working Group on Russian Sanctions under the Office of President of Ukraine. First of all, in your opinion, what is the future of Western sanctions against Russia at all, especially after this meeting in Saudi Arabia, when we heard from the State Secretary Rubio that any potential peace deal, yes, should include some concessions from different sides?
Well, first, let me just clarify that the working group that I coordinate is called the International Working Group on Russian Sanctions, and everybody that participates does so independently. We are not under the Ukrainian government. We talk to Mr. Yermak and other people. We talk to other governments, but everything we publish are our independent ideas. And in this age here in the United States, it's important to clarify that. To answer your question, I'm worried about sanctions from the American side. I've seen no interest in increasing them. I think it would help the negotiations to increase sanctions and to increase the flow of weapons to Ukraine so that the Ukrainian side would be in a stronger position going into these negotiations. By the way, many European leaders agree with me. I saw many European leaders in Munich last week, and we were all talking about increasing sanctions and the need to keep the pressure. But the United States does not seem to be interested in that. Having said that, I want to be clear, with respect to sanctions, in many ways, Europe is more important than the United States because the United States doesn't do a lot of trade with Russia these days. The real leverage comes from Europe. And in particular, I think right now is the time for Europe to seize those Russian assets, those Russian central bank assets that have been frozen in European accounts. This would be the time to do that, to put more pressure on Russia.
So can we suggest that maybe Trump's administration is expecting some of the steps from the European side to show that they are also very clear about their support of Ukraine, not only in their words, but in their actions as well?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think President Trump thinks that the Europeans don't do enough for their own security, haven't done enough for Ukraine. I disagree with them on that, but that's a strong view that he has, and a lot of Americans share that view. And I think in this moment, all European countries have to spend more on their own defense. They have to provide more assistance to Ukraine, and one of the ways to do that would be to seize those Russian assets and to use that money to help finance their assistance to Ukraine. I think that would be a very wise decision right now.
We remember how President Trump said in January that the United States could drive down oil prices. Do you think that this idea is still on the table?
I hope so. I mean, it would make a lot of sense. That would be another way to pressure Russia. And most certainly, President Trump has a good relationship with the leaders in Saudi Arabia. And if we wanted to decrease the money that Putin has to finance the war against your country, that would be a very wise thing to do. I hope they take steps towards that end.
What it depends on?
I think it's a decision between President Trump and the leaders of other oil exporting countries, especially in the Middle East, especially in Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Ambassador McFaul. We'll see how it will be going on. Thank you very much for the interview.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.